All right. I want to go through some of the essential points that have to, or that relate to the broader topic of interreligious contact. And this also goes to some extent for intercultural contact, where it's not explicitly religious in nature. But most of the examples that we're dealing with in class have to do with contact between peoples of different religions. And so I'll speak generally about this, but I will kind of draw reference to some of the specific texts that you were assigned to read for this class. And then we can, of course, have a fuller discussion of those things later. First of all, with some of these examples, we're dealing with contact between peoples who worship multiple gods. That is, they adhere to a polytheistic system, and peoples who only worship one god. And so this is an important consideration. Generally speaking, polytheistic systems are a good deal more tolerant of diversity of religion and a good deal more open to new religious ideas. And this is not a class on ancient history, but, we might consider, for instance, the phenomenon in ancient history where, say, the Romans encounter religious forms coming from Greece, or they become aware of them, and their response is not, well, I've never heard of that god, that must be a false god. It's like, oh, I've never heard of that god. Maybe I should learn about that god because it might be important for me to want to worship that god, right? What does that god do? What are the stories behind that god? And so, this is why what tends to happen in polytheistic systems over time is that they add deities, right? And often these are deities that come from other cultures that they come into contact with. They may come in some modified form. They may be conflated with deities that exist. And so the Romans, again, just as an example, the Romans worshipped a sky deity whom they called Jupiter. This seems to have been a more Indo-European-wide phenomenon. But the way that they worshipped Jupiter and the stories they told about Jupiter differed greatly from the stories that the Greeks told about him. But, once they understood that the Greeks worshipped Zeus, they were like, oh, well, it's the same god, right? That happens in some cases. In some cases, it doesn't happen. But generally speaking, polytheism is more open to these things. Monotheism, on the other hand, claims that there is only one God, and that is the only legitimate God. And so there are truth claims that are put into place that make it, generally speaking, there are perhaps some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, less tolerant. And, monotheism, even, monotheists who interact with other monotheists who may believe in a different way to approach that God or different things about that God, even if they might admit that they're worshiping the same God or that there is only one God, they will say, well, that's not the God that I worship because, the God that I worship requires these things. And so this produces these truth claims that are inherent in monotheism, lead to a tendency to reject any alternate forms of worship or alternate beliefs about God. And so, we're going to encounter in this class some instances where monotheism and polytheism interact, as for instance in the evangelization of the Germanic peoples of Northern Europe in the early Middle Ages. The Germanic peoples worshipped multiple gods, and these Christian missionaries were going to them, trying to convince them that polytheism was wrong, and that they should worship the Christian God, right? So that's one context. We could also, in the same period, look at the spread of Islam, and into places where there were polytheistic systems, as in all across the Arabian Peninsula. And especially over into India somewhat later, right, where Muslims encounter Hindus, and there's a good deal of tension that exists there, largely because of this tendency toward truth claims and intolerance that comes with monotheism. Another thing we have to pay attention to are power dynamics, right? And that's a very general thing to say. But in so many of these instances where, in fact, I would say this is really a defining feature of instances where one culture or one religion or people who adhere to one culture, one religion, come into contact with people from another religion or another culture, that generally speaking, the more powerful people will end up winning in the contest, so to speak, or this will become contentious, and the power, where the power rests, right? That becomes the dominant religious strain, and so we're going to see a lot of warfare between peoples of different religions, and if on the other hand, and this is another kind of related phenomenon, if those who hold power end up changing their religion, as is true in some of these examples of like early medieval Germanic kings adopting Christianity, then the power dynamics are such that the religion now chosen by the king becomes general for all of the people. That doesn't mean that they immediately convert to that religion, kind of heart and soul and practice and all of that, right? But generally speaking, those who hold power get to make the decisions about what the religion of the people is, right? So in any case, the power dynamics are something we have to pay attention to, okay? And I'm going to leave that a little bit vague because this is kind of on a case-by-case basis where but we always have to ask the question, like, who holds power here? And what kind of power is it? Is this just military power? Is it some other kind of power, right? When Christian missionaries, go into England, for instance, in the late 6th century or the early 7th century, the kings of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms who were not yet Christian, they have the power, but the Christians had a different kind of power, right? There's an appeal there, and we have to account for that, right? There are a different power dynamics that are less obvious than just we've got the biggest army and you need to obey, what you need to do what we tell you to do. You need to worship the God we tell you to worship, or something like that. So sometimes this can be nuanced. Another thing that we should pay attention to is what happens to sacred space. Sorry, let me stay on this point for a second. Sacred space meaning areas, buildings, locations, whether natural or man-made, that are set apart for the worship of divinity, or for things that involve contact between the human realm and the supernatural realm, right? When a sacred space from one tradition is penetrated by people who adhere to a different system, right? What happens in that case? Particularly if those who adhere to a different religious tradition hold power over the sacred space. What do they do with that sacred space? And obviously, in a lot of situations, if a place is taken over and it was considered sacred to those who adhered to a religious tradition that is now dominated by those who adhere to a different religious tradition, maybe the most common thing is for the newly dominant group to destroy or to desecrate that sacred space, right? To render it no longer sacred in some way. And this may be a direct challenge. So, again, referring to these early Christian missionaries, sometimes they would go into what were considered like sacred forests or groves of trees, and they would desecrate that. They would, purposefully chop down the trees or burn them or something like that to show that their God was more powerful than the God who was worshipped in that grove or that forest. But in some cases, and this is particularly true if the sacred space is durable, meaning it's an established building of some kind and that it's structurally sound, then the newly dominant power, the new religion, will simply take it over and transform it into a new sacred space. Now, there's some interesting dynamics that happen in that case. where the place that people have been accustomed to going to worship deity remains the place they keep going, and so it perhaps smooths the transition to the new religion. If it's the same place, it's just like it's under new management, so to speak, right? There's a new god worship there, but it's the same place we've always gone to participate in our religious duties. I have put on the slide here a picture of the Pantheon, which is a temple in Rome, city of Rome itself, right? And this was built in the first century CE, or right around the turn of, kind of the meridian of time, right? And it was built by Marcus Agrippa, who was a close confidant of, in fact, the right-hand man and future later son-in-law of Augustus Caesar. It was built as a structure to worship all deities. It was not specified as the temple of a single deity. That's why it's called the Pantheon. And this was the Romans' attempt to kind of cover all their bases. Like, if we have a foreign god, if there are foreigners who want to worship their deity and we don't have a temple to that deity, well, they can go to the Pantheon and offer a sacrifice to that deity, because this is an equal opportunity space, right, for anyone. Well, it's not coincidental then that this building, when Christianity started to take hold in Rome, that people would go there, to perform Christian religious functions. It was a space that allowed for that. And it eventually, once Christianity became the religion of choice of the emperors and of the power brokers in Rome, was simply turned into a Christian church, right? Most of the temples in the key Roman urban centers like Rome or Constantinople, or actually Constantinople, was kind of built from the ground up as a Christian city, so that's not a good example. But in other places throughout the Roman world, these temples were often destroyed. They were disassembled, and their bricks and stones and other things their pillars, their columns, were used then to construct Christian churches. In the case of the Pantheon, that was not necessary, because it was already a space that was available for Christian use. It was simply turned into a church. It's the only surviving Roman temple in the city of Rome itself, right? And that's because its function changed. The other thing we have to account for is kind of the persistence of religious topography, or the development of religious topography, that every civilization, every society, right, that has a religious component to it, which is the vast majority of societies in human history, they will lay down a religious topography. They will have a set of sacred spaces, right? What happens then when one religion or one culture comes into contact with those is one of the key questions we have to ask, or one of the things we have to account for in instances like that. What about religious minorities? This is, a key question. So, when a dominant religion takes over, as is the case in most civilizations, there is a dominant form of religion. In some cases, we have a kind of shared system between multiple religions or multiple, cultural sets. Like in China, you have the coexistence of Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, and while there is tension, there's often a lot of kind of overlapping conceptions, and even a sort of syncretism of these things, or an amalgamation of those beliefs. In Europe, on the other hand, in the Middle Ages, right, you have Christianity as the dominant religion. In the Middle East, during the medieval period, Islam is the dominant religion, right? And so what is the status of religious minorities? What do they have to do to continue to exist in that society? What sacrifices do they have to make? And what dangers do they face, right? What tensions exist between the majority and the minority? The key religious minority in the medieval period for Europe are the Jews. But, in the Muslim space, Christians become the minority. Although, initially Muslims are the minority, but they're ruling over the majority which would be Christians in many areas. In Palestine, in Egypt, right? Christianity was the dominant religion there, and it's gradually replaced by Islam. But that remains the dominant religion for quite a long time, for several centuries. And so, what does the newly ascendant minority, the conquerors, what is their relationship with the religious majority in that case, right? So the power dynamics related to minorities can shift either way. The minority may be the dominant group, or it may be in most cases, the majority is the dominant religion. We also have to distinguish between ideas and relationships, meaning, there are, when people who adhere to different religions come into contact with each other, there may be preformed ideas in the mind of, the one group or the other about the other group. And that those may be, through contact, those ideas may continue to develop. But even when those ideas exist, that they don't always impact or define the actual relationships that exist between the peoples of different religions. Now, that may seem a little vague, a little unclear. Okay, let me give you a concrete example. And so, during the medieval period, again, I'm using Europe as the example here, right? But we could find similar things in medieval India between, Hindus and Muslims, or Hindus and Buddhists. We could find similar things in the Middle East, between Muslims and those who continued to practice Christianity or Judaism or Zoroastrianism. All three of religions continued to persist, in the Middle East all through that period and into the modern period. But these ideas about the minority or about the other group, get crystallized in people's minds. But that doesn't, and those might be hostile. Those might be characterized by animosity. But that doesn't mean that the ideas always define the relationships between people. Okay? And so my own research has focused a lot on the relationships between Christian institutions like monasteries in medieval Europe and Jews. In the monasteries, monks studied theology, they read the Bible, they prayed, and contained within these theological materials they studied, right, in their doctrines and practices, were lots of ideas that were hostile to Jews. Ideas that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ, for instance, or that Jews were blind to the truth of Christianity, or that they were, too concerned with material things, that their carnal desires were getting in the way of, true belief or something like that, right? These are often extremely hostile claims, truth claims made by the majority religion. But on the other hand, monasteries often had close relationships with Jewish communities. They traded with them. They did business with them. There are even instances of, the abbot of a monastery being good friends with, a prominent Jew in the same place. And so the relationship in that case is, while it might be inflected or influenced by the ideas, the hostile ideas do not always make the relationship impossible, and they don't necessarily define the relationship either. And then finally, we need to understand that, at least in cases where people of different religions have had long-standing contact with each other, maybe even shared the same space, as is the case, with a lot of these examples we've looked at, Muslims and Christians and Jews living together in medieval Spain, for instance, or Jews and Christians in medieval Western Europe, or Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists living together in medieval India, or Confucians and Taoists and Buddhists living together in medieval China, right? That they ultimately participate in a shared culture. That, minorities are not necessarily insulated from the majority culture, that they participate in it together. That, and so there's been a lot of really interesting research done on this where, we're looking at the works written by Jews in the Middle Ages and seeing that, they're borrowing from Christian ideas about Mary or about Jesus or Christian, and, not just to reject those things, but actually to participate in them either aesthetically, artistically, or even theologically, philosophically, right? That these influence the way that the people of one religion, think about their own religion, right? And so a shared culture between peoples of different religions often exists in these medieval spaces. All right, so those are some important points or some important issues that have to do with this broader theme. And armed with that perspective, or the various perspectives this gives us, then we can look at some specific examples in class. Thanks. Oh, there is one other point. Darn, I thought that I was done with this. Okay. On the other hand, even though there is shared culture, right, there is in many of these particularly monotheistic systems that exist in the Middle Ages. This is true for Christianity. It's true for Islam. It might have been true for Judaism, but the Jews in no case are the majority culture at this point in time. They had been, in some spaces in the ancient world, and had carried on, wars in the name of God. Like, for instance, the Jewish rebellions against Rome, right, could be considered holy war. Okay, but the Jews are really in no position to wage holy war at any point in the Middle Ages. But Christians and Muslims certainly did have traditions of holy war, right? That fighting for God, fighting for their truth claims, fighting to assert their dominance over people who mean them harm becomes a key point, a key theological tenet in the religion. And so the Muslim idea of jihad, for instance, right, holy war, although that is commonly misunderstood, jihad can be applied simply to one's struggle against sin, like an individual sort of thing. But it can also be applied to war against those who do not believe in the right ways in Allah. The Crusades are a good example of something that's inspired by holy war. The Christians treat this as a war to reclaim these sacred spaces, right, that are associated with the life of Jesus. The Muslims also consider Jerusalem to be a sacred space and fight to reclaim it after the Christians have taken it, using the principles of jihad as laid out in their sacred literature. Muslims, invading India in the medieval period certainly saw themselves as waging jihad against the infidel polytheistic Hindus, and so forth and so on, right? Timur the Great, despite the atrocities that he committed frequently, saw himself as engaged in holy war against peoples who did not, worship Islam or practice Islam properly, or who were non-Muslims and thus infidels. And so holy war is another concept that exists a lot. All right, so sorry about the abortive attempt to end, but I think that is the last point, so we'll go ahead and close this. Thanks.